success really breeds motivation in students, but also in teachers. And so giving them really specific things to focus on, to work on, I think can really help them see that change and feel that success. What schools really like to have is clarity. Just having a document isn't going to change practice, but it is enough to say, okay, this is something where we can start to focus on the next 2-3 years of strategy for schools. And there's so much ability for schools to collaborate when they have that shared language.
Welcome to the Flourishing Podcast, where we shine a light on the practices, principles and people shaping Catholic education across Melbourne. This is your space for deep, meaningful conversations all about teaching, leading and learning in a flourishing system. I'm Danny Jaber, and I'm the lucky one that gets to bring you these stories and insights that help us shape the MAC system. Today, I'm joined by Katie Roberts-Hull. Katie is an international education policy specialist with expertise in teacher quality and school improvement. Experienced both as a teacher, a leader, a researcher, and a consultant, Katie's going to offer us lots of wisdom today, and her forward-thinking ideas are going to challenge us and hopefully inspire us as we move forward as a system. So let's get into it. Katie, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Katie, I thought we'd start just by thinking about your background, because I think it's really important that we get to know how you got to this point in your career. What led to it? What's inspired you? Just give us a bit of a story, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I started my career as a teacher, year 5 teacher in the US. I taught in a border community on the border of Texas and Mexico. So it was a very kind of rural farming community, lots of disadvantage. And I was just really interested in sort of being part of that community. It was a big teacher shortage time like we've had in the last few years. So they just needed a lot of great teachers to come in and teach. And I was lucky enough to go there. And I guess that set me off in what I do now, because my first few years of teaching, while I love the students, I love the school, I love the community, it was really hard being a teacher, and especially in a time where I think this was true back then and probably is still true for a lot of teachers today, where you are given a lot of autonomy when you first get into a classroom. You can kind of do whatever you want in some ways, but you're not given much support. And certainly at that time, I didn't really have curriculum resources to draw on. I was left alone, which in some ways was nice, but really as a first-year teacher was pretty terrifying. And so it kind of started to drive me into a mentality of thinking about, well, is there a better way that systems can be set up to support teachers, to make sure they have resources that are kind of well-structured so they don't have to start from scratch on everything? Because that was definitely my experience. And I think that's kind of what led me into being more interested in, well, can I find a career path where I can better support teachers? One of my first jobs out of teaching was working more on kind of the school operations side, because that was another interest of mine. Working in schools is, how can we make systems more efficient and easier for teachers so there's not so much admin work? And that's also what led to me thinking about more of the research on what actually helps teachers improve, what makes their lives a little bit easier. Curriculum resources is definitely one area, but even just professional support structures inside of schools and inside systems as well. So really the last part of my career for the last about 15 years has been in that space of looking at the research, and lately in the last few years really looking at applying that research back into schools and systems as well. Yeah,
I think that initial entry into education that you shared there, I think that's shared by so many teachers globally, and even here still in Victoria in our Catholic schools. That sense of feeling alone. You take a step out of university and suddenly those supports disappear and you're making decisions all by yourself. And 95 to 98% of the time you are on your own. And so being able to take the research, being able to work with the expertise that exists around us and then being able to apply it, as you say, is such an important aspect of any teacher's career.
Exactly.
And so many years ago, not that many years ago, I presume, but Think Forward Education was established. And you obviously work very closely with Dr. Nathaniel Swain, who many of our audience members will be very, very aware of. He is someone that has inspired many. He still works within the realms of Catholic education as well as schools across Victoria as a state. And of course, he has done a lot of work around science of learning. What led to you guys establishing Think Forward Education in the first place?
So Nate was really involved with a kind of Melbourne-based community of educators, I think around the time of COVID, when everybody was going online. People were also just at that time, around 2019, starting to think more about evidence-based practices, especially in early literacy. That was before the phonics mandate, way before a lot of schools really understood kind of the resources that were available in that area. Sure. So there were teachers coming together to discuss that with Nate. And I think because of the time of COVID, everything was virtual. They started doing webinars. This was, by the way, before I was involved in this community. So it was really these teachers and kind of Nate kind of leading that group that were coming together. When I came on board with Think Forward Educators, the community had been established. They had already done a lot of great collaboration, been sharing knowledge for a few years, but needed a bit more structure into how to organize the group, how to set creative ways of doing the programming that could actually reach more people around the country. And so that's kind of the role I played coming into it, was to take it from this somewhat informal but massive growing community into something that can be a more kind of formalized, not-for-profit organization. And so I sort of set up some of those structures to set that in place. Now, Think Forward Educators is being led by Jeanette Breen, who is just an incredible Victorian educator. She's been involved with Think Forward Educators from the very beginning. And I think it's just great to have that community in the hands of educators who are going to keep leading it. And, it's cross-sectoral. It's actually, the entire of Australia now that's part of it. Wow. But it's really been a catalyst for leading a lot of practice change in school, but also policy change, because I think all these teachers coming together and saying, this is actually where we want to see teacher practice go has been a huge influence on different systems. And knowing that teachers actually do support this, it's not something that's just coming from, a few experts or the research. Actually, there's a group of tens of thousands of teachers and leaders that actually support a direction to be kind of more evidence-based, more science of learning-based instruction. So that's been a really important community that's being carried on now.
Yeah, it's incredible. And that growth and that leverage that you talk about there, how's that supported you now as you move into your current role, leading as managing director of Teachwell? And I suppose, what learnings could you take from those years with Think Forward Education that you're now able to absorb and work forward with your new role?
I think this idea of having teachers create knowledge together and go through kind of a self-reflection process on their current practices is something that was really important part of Think Forward Educators. It's also part of the research on how educators improve, and it's definitely a component of Teachwell's programs. So I joined Teachwell in the middle of last year in 2025. And it was already a very high-functioning, well-established professional learning organization that was started by Ingrid Seeley. But it's expanding now, and especially on the east coast of Australia, because it was really born out of Perth. But the core of Teachwell has always been about building that knowledge that teachers and leaders need, and talking a lot about the why. So why are these practices important? What is the evidence base around them? Giving teachers and leaders kind of a view into understanding different models of what this could look like as well in practice. So for primary and secondary, it might look different, for example, to do kind of full participation tactics in the classroom. So what does that look like? I think it's really tough, and the research says this too about professional learning, that teachers do want really specific practices that they can implement the next day. But it's really hard for teachers to be flexible with those practices unless they really have that background knowledge and that understanding of the why. So that's a critical part of what Teachwell does, is build that why, build that understanding, and give them some practical tools and practices they can actually use tomorrow in their practice as well.
And so how do you see Teachwell evolving then to continue that support for schools, continue that support for teachers? And I suppose then kind of taking on board the evolution of research as and when it occurs?
It's really challenging to think about kind of the innovations in research and how and when you might apply them into kind of structured programs like Teachwell has. I think Teachwell is kind of unique in Australia in that we kind of have our own guaranteed and viable curriculum for how we do professional learning. So instead of having kind of a guru that sort of leading their own version of professional learning. What Teachwell has is a codified set of professional learning programs that we train our presenters to deliver in a very consistent way. So you know that if you come to a Teachwell program, the quality and the content is going to be the same no matter where you are in Australia. And so we're very careful about changing and adapting those programs and very deliberate about it. And I think what works well at Teachwell is we have these really expert educators that are part of our team that all through their collective knowledge and their research come together to make those adaptations. And we do it in a way that really responds to the needs of the teachers that we're working with as well, to think about, when we're going to school visits or when we're seeing videos of them in practice, what are the key challenges that we're seeing them experience, and where can we maybe pull a little bit more on some evidence to build their knowledge and build their practice as well.
Yeah. I think I worked really closely with Teachwell last year in our secondary schools. And I think one of the things that I took away from the whole program was the vulnerability required to video yourself and share that with someone so that they can look at your practice and critique. But it seemed to be a really valuable experience.
Yes. Yeah. It's a massively valuable experience, but it's really hard to not just to video yourself, but to even watch yourself teaching, which is part of what Teachwell really encourages, that self-reflection of teachers. And a lot of the teachers that are going through, for example, our masterclass in high impact instruction are doing that process for the first time. But there's a lot of really good evidence that having that reflection of yourself on video, looking at the practices can really help you improve. And we've had a lot of good feedback from teachers that go through this 9-month program and have different videos of their practice where they can actually point out and see their improvements over time. Yep. So that's a really important part of this work, is that teachers feel that success themselves, because as we know, success really breeds motivation in students, but also in teachers. So we want them to feel that sense of success as well. And so giving them really specific things to focus on, to work on for those video coaching practices, I think can really help them see that change and feel that success.
Yeah. And am I right in saying then there's some overlap with what you're doing with Teachwell and, of course, working with another organisation that Max is very, very close with in terms of real uptake in terms of our teachers utilising Ochre education resources and the Max resources alongside that. What's the future look like there, and how are things tracking along in that side of things?
Yeah, so right when I joined Teachwell, Ochre also became a partner of Teachwell. And that's been really interesting because we know that Teachwell has done a lot of work for years in high-impact teaching practices. Ochre has really high-quality curriculum materials, and now we're able to bring those together and actually deliver professional learning based on specific curriculum resources. So that's just going to make it a lot more coherent for the teachers and the schools that are using those resources. Teachwell does work with schools that are using any type of resources, but now for those schools that are using Ochre, we can get even more specific. Well, with what does this look like in a primary math class where you're using Ochre resources? Here are the things that are in the Ochre resources that we can pull out and tie into the evidence based on what great teaching looks like. We can create these video libraries of teachers using these in practice, which I think really helps with just examples of what does this look like. So that's what we're hoping to do more of now that we have this partnership. And I know we've already done a lot of that with Max already. So I think Teachwell has worked with more than 2,200 educators across Max over the last few years. And part of that has been in this Teaching for Impact in Mathematics series, where we are doing a really kind of specific professional learning experience about the Ochre resources, what best practice in math looks like according to evidence, but also tying that into what we know about great teaching just in general.
Amazing. I think we've seen the growth shoots there from the improvements in the NAPLAN results over the last year or so, and long may that continue. And then touching on those Ochre resources, obviously the collaboration with Teachwell means that the professional learning side of things is definitely going to benefit from that. What have you seen as some of the benefits from our Max teachers utilising those Ochre resources in the first place?
I think teachers just love not having to start from scratch. That's something that I definitely would have loved when I was starting off teaching, and being able to use resources flexibly as well. So one kind of nice thing about the Ochre resources is, they're not scripted, but they have a lot of options for teachers in them. And so one of the things that we're really working with schools on is learning how to use those resources flexibly to meet kind of student needs. And so that includes, for example, taking daily review and thinking about what are the different levels that I know of with my students because of assessments that I've done, because of checking for understanding that I've done, and being able to kind of choose and deploy pieces of a daily review that I know will meet the students' needs and make sure that they're, not underwhelmed, but also not overwhelmed by the content. Sure. So those types of flexible adaptations are really where we're seeing a lot of progress at Max, where, I think some schools have been using the resources for a few years now.
Yeah.
They've done a lot of work on intellectual prep, so moved from probably structures where they were doing mostly like lesson planning in teams, creating things, to more of that intellectual prep in teams, reviewing and adapting resources to meet the needs of their students. And we've just seen some schools doing so much work in this area and having some success. We were at a few schools recently, McKillop College and Werribee, where I know at the beginning of the year they were about to do a ton of work on that intellectual prep piece and curriculum design, which was really exciting. And we've done some work more extensively, too, with the Catholic Regional College in St. Albans. And they're just really interesting because they have this consistent, really engaged staff. They're serving students that are from lower socioeconomic kind of status, and they're just getting great results. And they're already saying as well, because of the system work that Max is doing as a secondary school, that they can see that students coming in now in year 7 are starting to have kind of similar preparation as their current students. So they're actually able to speed up the pace of learning because the primary schools are sort of all in alignment now. So that just speaks to the benefit of doing this as a system change and having these kind of system-wide consistent frameworks and supports that are really making a difference for schools.
That's amazing to hear. And it's great to hear some schools name dropped as schools that are working towards not only, I suppose, developing those practices, because it's an adjustment, isn't it? We're going from having very little time in education to plan, prepare lessons, let alone create those lessons, let alone create the resources to enable the planning around it. And so adjusting from that to a mindset whereby it's, okay, I've got the lessons in front of me now, I've got the presentations, but how do I prepare those suitably for the children, the students that I'm going to have in front of me on that day? And I think some misconceptions have grown from that. There is that kind of adage of death by PowerPoint where as a teacher, I feel the responsibility just to kind of click through those slides, or the other adage being, it's a DJ pressing play and then standing back and kind of watching as things take place. So what kind of advice do you have for schools that are maybe struggling with those concepts?
It's very important to have that intellectual prep time for teachers. So whether that's teachers taking time that would have been used for planning to take that time collaboratively, or to make sure that there's kind of school-wide structures for what this looks like. I know that an educator called Sonia Loudon has done some presentations on this for Ochre, and she has some really good advice just based on her own school as well. But that tends to involve frameworks around, what are the key questions that teachers are going to be answering during intellectual prep. So, for example, even practicing rehearsing some of the things that are in the lesson. Yeah. If it's a math lesson, actually doing the work as a teacher of going through the examples yourself and thinking about, well, how long will this take? What are the potential misconceptions that I know students will be coming out with, and pre-writing or pre-addressing those in the lesson. So yeah, doing that rehearsal just of the lesson itself, but collaboratively thinking through what does our student data look like as well, so that we can make sure we're kind of hitting the right level for students in our classrooms is very important. And I do think that we want these lesson resources, especially high-quality lesson resources like Ochre, to save teachers time. But in practice, we know that it's probably going to take about the same amount of time. They'll fill that time in different ways. But hopefully, what you'll get to as a teacher and as a school is that you're using less time just finding random images from the internet or trying to pick things out of different places on Facebook groups, and more time on actually being able to intellectually think through the lessons or think about your student data and kind of piece that together into something that will be an even more effective lesson.
Absolutely. And so we've touched on Teachable, we've touched on Ochre, and I suppose thinking more about system resources, we've got our vision for instruction, we've got our vision for engagement, and the soon to be released assessment position paper. How do you think these system documents support but also challenge teachers to maybe be a bit different in their approach to teaching?
I think the vision for instruction, that was one of the first frameworks that Max came out with, was great in setting the stage for what was to come in terms of, more professional learning and more work with schools. I think that what schools really like to have is clarity around, where are we going, especially to have something that stays consistent for more than just a few years. That's one of the biggest things for schools. And so to have an anchoring framework, vision for engagement, instruction, now the assessment paper as well, those really help to be that anchor and to provide that guidance for schools. Just having a document isn't going to change practice, but it is enough to say, okay, this is something where we can start to focus on the next 2-3 years of strategy for schools, where they know where they're going and they know where the system is going. And it also helps create that shared language. I think that's really important. And that's the tough thing. I mean, as an individual teacher in a classroom, sometimes you can feel like an island, but schools as a whole feel like that as well. And there's so much ability for schools to collaborate when they have that shared language, when there's a framework of like, what does great teaching look like in our system? And we're kind of all aligned as schools. And so that we can actually, band together to share resources or to moderate assessments or to think about doing sort of joint professional learning together. I think that makes a massive difference. So yes, I think that those frameworks are critical. They're just the first step. Obviously, there's a lot more that schools need to be able to implement high quality teaching and learning. But I do think it's a great first step to create that alignment.
And so you've got so much experience to lean on here as I ask you this question. Thinking about your experience both in policy making, but also as a teacher, but also as a consultant to schools. If I'm a teacher in a Max school, and I have been a teacher in a Max school, by the way, what should I be considering when I'm thinking about the professional learning that I require to help me support my school's work around those documents?
Definitely looking at the why of the research. So often schools will try to just pick up programs, and I love programs, but it is hard, I think, as a school, especially if you're a middle leader in a school, to get every teacher on board and to even get teams of teachers on board without being able to go into the why and connect it to that evidence. And not just the evidence on, from randomized controlled trials about what works best, but the evidence of student learning in your own school. So that piece of looking at where are students at, where are their needs, and being able to tailor your professional learning or your school's professional learning to the student needs in your school that you're seeing, I think can really help and can help create that why as well. And it is really important, I guess, anytime schools are thinking about doing more professional learning or building capacity with teachers, to also think about, is there something that we could potentially stop doing that can free up time for teachers to actually have time to implement, the new knowledge that they're gaining? So schools that have been more successful, I think, have gone through a big process like that of thinking about, are there things that we can essentially, de-implement or remove from teachers' responsibility that will give them the space to really engage in this new learning, either whether that's just release time or whether that's, new structures of professional learning in their school, and then a bit of time and resources to actually implement that in their classrooms the next day. That can make a huge difference for teachers to actually feel like there's not just more being added on, but that there's more focused things being added on.
Yeah, because there's always that notion of feeling like we've done this before, or feeling like this is a very cyclical thing and we're coming back round to this again. So I think there's something to take away there for leaders as well in terms of how they approach the professional learning to support the teachers as well. Yeah. And one theme that has stood out, Katie, is the idea of equity. You started at the very beginning talking about how you were inspired to get into education in the first place. You spoke about what some of our schools are doing to try and bridge the gap in some very difficult environments, and in terms of how Max is supporting that with the system documents we've got in place. How do you see this issue of equity carried out in schools across our system, and what do you see as being maybe the thing that our leaders need to take into consideration to just be wary of in the next few years?
The biggest thing with equity is reducing the teacher lottery or the school lottery that students experience. So I think the more systems and the more schools are trying to create that consistent teaching and learning experience for students, the better it is for equity. And my original interest in education was serving disadvantaged students and schools that were serving kind of more equity cohorts of students, and making sure those schools were actually getting the right structures and supports in place to support teachers who were teaching those students. But I think this applies to every school, because we know that schools and teachers are seeing, more complexities with students coming into the schools, whether it's kind of things that are still related to COVID, students being out of school for a few years, or more neurodivergence they're seeing in classrooms, or just different complexities that they're experiencing. So having those more consistent teaching and learning frameworks, I think, helps all students, but particularly those students who might have slightly different learning needs, might be coming from slightly different backgrounds, or might just have various other challenges in entering school or attending school. Having those kind of those feelings of kind of trust and safety in school really do relate to school-wide approaches, feeling like when students are going from teacher to teacher, they're actually having a very consistent experience. And I'm also really interested in the Max approach to the vision for engagement for that as well, because, while most of my work is focused on teaching and learning, I think that engagement piece is really interesting to think about. How do we have structures to help get attendance up? What would that look like? And to think about student motivation as well, to think about, how success really breeds motivation, and being able to give all students that feeling of success, even if it's something small to start with, but to make sure that teachers are supported to be able to do that really well for all students.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Katie. I think we've got so much we can take away, not only as a system, but I think there is plenty there for leaders of schools and for teachers as well, and plenty for us to ponder as we plot our futures within professional learning and what it is we're aspiring to do with our students, who are, of course, the focal point of everything we do. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
So if you have enjoyed today's episode and you want to hear more insights from more experts who are very much in the thick of the education game, then please tune in again to the Flourishing Podcast. You can find this on YouTube at Flourishing Learners. You can also find us on your favourite podcast listening apps. So if you're into Spotify, or if you're on Apple Music, or if you're on the podcast app, you will find this podcast on there. And also, if you want to contribute to this podcast, if you've got any questions for future guests, if you've got any ideas for maybe how we can mix things up a little bit on this podcast, we've got an email set up ready for you to send in your ideas. That's podcast@max.vic.edu.au. And so any ideas, any inspiration, send it our way. And so until next time, keep flourishing.